Okay, just a quick around the room. How old do people think baobabs are? 400. Any?
1,000.
1,000? We've got thousands? 7,000. Okay. Okay. Good. So, but what's clear to me is that you don't know the real answer. Okay. Which is okay. So this is a story that starts with this baobab. This is the it's on the plain in front of the Outpost Lodge in the north of Kruger National Park. And it fell over. I got to hear about it, and I asked permission to go and get a date on it. At that stage, I was working at the CSIR doing radiocarbon dating, and I was given permission. And it was the start of quite a long journey. This is probably 20 years or so now. Now, I'm afraid I have to give you a little bit of background about how radiocarbon dating works, just so that you know what I'm talking about. Now, I have two ways of explaining this. My experience teaching it to students is that the best analogy is beer. So what we see in the middle is somebody pouring beer into a glass, but the glass has got a hole in it. And so the beer is leaking out at the same time. And what I want you to do a bit of a thought experiment with this. If you were pouring in, let's say this glass was much taller than it is. If you were pouring in faster than it was leaking out, then because more is going in than is leaking out, the level would get higher. The higher the level goes, the faster it leaks. Can you see that eventually you're going to reach the point where the leak will match the rate of that you're pouring in? Now let's do it the other way around. What if it's leaking faster than you're pouring it in? Well, then the level will go down, the leak rate will decrease. Can you see that eventually your leak rate and your pouring in rate will match?
Yeah.
Now, we've got some interesting nuclear chemistry that's happening in our atmosphere, and that is that we are being bombarded by neutrons from out of space. So the top left picture here shows you a sort of indication of what's happening. You have these neutrinos coming in from outer space, and they interact with molecules in our upper atmosphere. And nitrogen, which has an atomic mass of 14, is converted into carbon-14. So that is the equivalent of our beer being poured in. We're producing the isotope carbon-14, which is radioactive. At the bottom left, you can see a little graph, which it's on the x-axis you can't really see it, so clearly is time, and on the y-axis is how much carbon-14 would you have if you started out with, say, 1. Well, in physics, if you wait for one half-life, after one half-life you'll have half. Wait for another half-life, you'll have a quarter. So there's this decay where the carbon-14, the radioactive element, will be decaying away. So we have two processes there. We've got production, the pouring in of the beer, and we've got radioactive decay, which is the leakage of the system. And as a result, the amount of carbon-14 that exists in the atmosphere is more or less constant through time. So now, that is in the atmosphere. The carbon-14 that's produced in the atmosphere reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, and this is a tree society. You will understand that trees suck up carbon dioxide. So they are busy taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which includes carbon-14 dioxide. And that gets sealed up through the metabolic processes into the rings of the tree as it grows. Now, as soon as a ring has been laid down inside a tree, the access to the production side, the beer pouring, stops. And so what happens is all we have is the starting amount of carbon-14. As time goes by, it's going to get less and less because it's radioactive. Now, the isotope carbon-12 is stable. It doesn't decay away. So if I look at the ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14, it tells me how old something is. So there's my one slide introduction to how radiocarbon dating works. And if you want more details, I can really go over the top of this. this is one of my bragging slides. So, in order to measure carbon-14, when I was at the CSIR, we had a dungeon sort of underground. I've moved to this facility, NRF-iThemba LABS now, and that is a particle accelerator. And I use this particle accelerator. I've got to throw out some numbers here. Inside that accelerator, I accelerate carbon particles using 3.5 million volts. And under those conditions, I can detect carbon-14. It's quite rare. Anyway, it's enough bragging that we'll move on. So you want to know how old baobabs are? Should we get on to that? It's a bit too soon to tell you the age. Okay, so let's start off. You know, from what I just described, every year a tree, as it is growing, is assimilating new carbon from the atmosphere, but the older rings don't have that link. So they are carbon-14 wise, getting older and older. So it will be the centermost part of the tree that is the oldest. If I want to know the age of the tree, I've got to get to the center of it. So the top left here, you can see that baobab, that first baobab, and there's a really interesting characteristic of the male ego. When you see a baobab lying on its side, you kind of say, okay, I want to get to the center of it, give me a chainsaw. And sure enough, after 3 days, we had not made a dent into that tree. But yeah, we learned a lesson. So the bottom right is another baobab that fell over, where we really set aside enough time and we cut almost like a door into this dead tree. And then you can see me using a chainsaw there to cut a sample from the bark to the center of the tree. But we really got a lot smarter. We got hold of this tree borer, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with that. The nice thing about a tree borer is it's not fatal to the tree, especially not baobabs. So you can put this thing into the tree and remove a core. This was a borer made specifically for baobabs. So it's 1.5 meters long. You can see it's the width of the bucky bonnet there. And the top right, you can see us removing a core from a baobab. So that allows me to get 1.5 meters into a tree, which means any tree with a 3-meter diameter I can roughly sample. I thought this was going to be kind of useful until I came up against how big baobabs really are. If they've got a 6-meter diameter, it's not very helpful. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about some of the things that we learned before I tell you about the dates themselves. This is the footprint of a baobab that we call the Lebombo baobab. I don't know if anybody's done that 4-wheel drive trail down the eastern side of Kruger National Park. This is the baobab that's just inside Mozambique. So you climb under the fence with your passport to go and sample it. And we took a number of cores from this tree. Now, what you see in the middle of the tree is a big hollow. So it's like a cave. You can walk inside. I'll show you a photograph a bit later of what that cave is like. You can fit 15 people inside there. And what we did was we cored from the outside going in and from the inside going out, because at this stage we were using a 60 centimeter borer. There's no ways we could get to the center of the wood structure that was there. And then is this feedback? Okay. I see. Okay. Right. So the curious thing about this was when we started getting dates. Now you can see that a lot of the cores are paired, and let's look at 5 and 15. If you start with 15 and you look at that core going from the outside of the tree, from the bark going inwards, you would expect that as it goes inwards, it would get older. And that's exactly what happened. Now we imagine that this hollow in the tree is where the tree has hollowed out, and the middle of the tree was originally in the center of that space. So when we put the core number 5 in, we expected as you go down that core from right to left, it's going to get younger and younger. But it got older and older. And so, okay, well, that's interesting. Obviously, it means that the original center of the tree was somewhere between 15 and 5. Then we jump across to 1 and 11, and sure enough, going in from the outside in number 11, it got older and older as we went further into the tree. But when we got to number 1, it got older and older as we were going outwards again. So then the center of the tree has to be between 1 and 11. And this can't be, both of these positions cannot be true. And what this led us to understand, and I'm going to show you some pictures about it in a moment, is that you cannot view baobabs as a single tree. A lot of these big monumental baobabs that you see are not single stem trees. They are multiple stems that are fused together. And I'll talk more about that. It's included in the test later on. Just keep in mind that these are multi-stem trees. What we also discovered about this was that when we took cores from the inside of the tree going outwards, the first thing that we encountered was bark. Now, if this was originally a single stem tree, and somehow it hollowed out, and we got, why is there bark on the inside? There's a cute story about that, and it's because these are succulents, not trees. But I'm sure that somebody was going to ask me that question. So we knew that we had multiple stems that are fused together. We've got these cavities inside the trees, which we used to think were genuine cavities, but we renamed them false cavities because these trees are actually growing inwards as well as outwards. That's what we saw from the radiocarbon dates. And then linked to this is the fact that we've got these multiple stems and they always seem to be in a sort of circular structure. So this is a baobab from northern Namibia. And you could go into that crack and you would have a circle of little baobab, well, not so little, of baobabs around you, each different stems. And then this is the third thing I wanted to tell you about. So we've got the fact that they're multi-stemmed. They form these stem rings. And the third thing is that they do something quite odd. Sometimes we will take a core into the tree and you'll go produce dates as you go along the core, and then suddenly there's a big jump and suddenly it gets much older. So what you see in the graph there on the x-axis is our core length. The 0 would be the bark, and this was a 40 centimeter borer. And then on the y-axis would be sort of radiocarbon dates that we got along the core. And look at the green one. You can see a number of dates which make sense that in the first 20 centimeters, it was probably no more than about 40 years. But then suddenly it jumps to 600 years, and we see normal growth prior to that. So somewhere around 20 centimeters, that tree stopped growing for 600 years and then started growing again. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that there's a couple of challenges in trying to generate the age of the trees. I'm probably giving away some answers here to that question that I asked, but let's move on. Okay, this is a placeholder, but I want you to gaze upon this magnificent tree. This is the lunar baobab. I don't know if anybody has been to it. Up in the, it's on the Venetia farm up in Limpopo. No, not Swartwater. Swartwater, I've got there's another picture. No, this is another. But I want you to look at on the left, and what you can see is a pretty normal Mapani tree with 3 buckies parked underneath it. That gives you an idea of how big this tree is. It's truly monumental. Now, there have been 2 research programs that I've been involved in. My interest in in looking at baobabs was always to reconstruct the climate record from them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I've also been collaborating with Adrian Patru, who he's not really interested in the climate. He just wants to know how old are baobabs. And so he's traveled around the world and he's dated baobabs all over the place. And so I'm going to talk about both projects, but on Adrian's project, I'm going to talk about an article that I co-authored, which is the demise of the largest and oldest African baobab. So we'll get to that. Let me start off with the climate record. So if I take a core from the tree, the innermost part is the oldest, and the outermost part is just recently grown, and everything else in between represents a time series. And in normal dendrochronology, you would measure the ring widths, and from the ring widths, you might be able to reconstruct climate. Now, the problem with baobabs is their rings are not annual. I say that, but they have rings, number one. Number two, I've counted the rings and compared them to the radiocarbon dates, and it varies. Sometimes, the worst case, we had 6 rings formed per year. The best case was a baobab that had annual rings. And I think that that's quite interesting because it tells you something about their adaptation. If they grow in an area that's very prone to droughts, and if you have a good rainfall supply, so you're not having these seasonal droughts, then the soil might wet up and the baobabs are able to grow through the entire year or through the entire growing season. But it can be in places like the Limpopo Valley that you have a rainfall event, it doesn't actually wet the soil enough, but the tree takes what water it can. I don't know if you've seen the root structures of baobabs. I was in Kruger now, and you could be 30 meters away from the tree and you can find the roots. So they've got these extensive shallow roots. And when it rains, they can intercept that water near the surface. They're not looking for deep water. So they'll suck up this water, they'll grow, but then maybe it doesn't rain again for another 6 weeks and they'll sit there and wait. Then it rains and then they'll grow again. So my interpretation of the ring count that I'm getting is that it's not a seasonal cycle like in the Northern Hemisphere you might get the temperature cycle or the sunlight cycle controlling rings forming in a tree. With baobabs, I think it's got to do with the episodic nature of soil moisture for them. Anyway, so we have this time series, and instead of using the rings as an indicator of whether it was a good or a bad year, I do some chemical analyses. It's on the left-hand side, it's delta 13C. I don't really want to go into what that means, but it's plotted in a manner that gives you a rainfall history. So on the x-axis is time, starting 1,000 years ago, going through to 2000, roughly when we sampled these trees. And what you can see is values that plot high up are high rainfall and low down are low rainfall. And this is really interesting for me, anyway, as a climate scientist, because if you look just after 1800, I don't know if in that red record, I don't know if you can see a really bad and protracted drought. So that little dip. So that was a drought that was the equivalent of the 2015 El Nino. I don't know if you remember how bad the drought was in 2015. Only it lasted 40 years. So, I mean, there's interesting things that come out of here. You can see that 1,000 years ago, the rainfall was much better. And this was in the Limpopo Valley. This is when the kingdom of Mapungubwe flourished. And we see in this record a drought that saw the end of the Mapungubwe kingdom. But I use the climate records a little bit differently. So I've sampled trees from all over the place, and I've just thrown up a couple of graphs. But basically, I've got, for any point, wherever I've sampled a tree, I've got the rainfall variability at that point, and then at another point. So I've got this space-time matrix of how rainfall has changed over southern Africa. And I'm using that to test climate change models. Now, just give me a few seconds to explain this. I know that this is not how old are baobabs, but I hope that you know it's interesting enough. So on the left is a study that was done quite a while ago, where using satellites, they were able to detect where do the clouds sit over southern Africa. And our summer rainfall comes from a cloud band that extends from northwest to southeast. And you can see in those four figures on the left-hand side that sometimes that cloud band sits at the left, that's the top figure. And then it sits sort of intermediate, and sometimes it sits right over the Indian Ocean over Madagascar. Now, if our cloud band is sitting over Madagascar, we're in a drought. If it's sitting nicely over the middle of Gauteng, we've got nice rain. And the authors suggested that that was driven by the temperature of the ocean in the Indian Ocean. So that kind of makes sense to me. So what I did was I took two of my records, one from the east, one from the west, and I just subtracted the one from the other. And it said, is it raining more on the left or on the right? That's that, you know, just subtracting left from right just tells you, was it left or right raining? And so the white plot that you see there is 500 years of, was it raining left or right? I don't really mind which one it is because I can't remember which way around it is. But then plotted in red is the sea surface temperature, which is reconstructed from corals in the south of Madagascar. And you can see quite a nice correlation between, you know, the variability in red, sea surface temperature, and whether it rains to the left or right. So we've got the empirical data on the left, which comes from satellites. We've got the baobab records. We've got the ocean coral records that says, yes, our cloud band shifts left or right, depending on how warm the Indian Ocean is. Do climate models reproduce that? And what you see in that bottom graph is in a climate model. We ran a climate model for 1,000 years. And then we asked the model to correlate sea surface temperature in the Indian Ocean with outgoing long-wave radiation. That's where are clouds. And so where you get red, you have a positive correlation. In other words, the ocean gets warmer, you get more clouds. Where it's blue, the ocean gets warmer, you get less clouds. And what you can see is a northwest-southeast axis of blue, and when the sea gets warmer, the cloud band moves out over Madagascar, less rain over Africa, more rain over the Indian Ocean. The climate model gets it exactly right. Now, I'm just throwing up one test here, but I've tested everything that I can on the climate models, and every single time the model gets what we see in the baobabs. So that for me is just an indication we should probably take climate forecasts seriously. Okay, you wanted to know how old are baobabs. Let's get on to that. So this comes from work with Adrian again. That's the Swartwater baobab, by the way. So I'm going to give you the top 10. We've dated many baobabs. Number 10 is 1,400 years old. That's the Lebombo baobab. That's the one that I told you about with the hollow, where Luna, that baobab that I showed you with the 3 buckies under that's 1,500 years. In Zim, we've got another 1,500. Grootboom in Namibia, 1,500. We need drum rolls here. Magaliesberg, 1,600. Another one in Zimbabwe, 1,800. I'm going to move forward because everybody wants to know what number 1 is. Deutschland in Namibia, 2,100 years. Okay, anybody want to guess what the next one is? Anybody want to change their previous guess? 2.5. Okay. So I look, that for me was quite an interesting result, but I want to qualify this because there's something odd going on with baobabs. And remember the test I told you, those 3 factors. How does that influence the way that we interpret the dates? We're going to get into that. Here's a bit of a tragedy. There's that same list of baobabs. Panke, the 2,500-year-old baobab, is dead. Dorsland is dead. Glencoe has collapsed but hasn't died. Holboom is dead. Makuruleboom, it's collapsed, not dead. Grootboom, dead. Now, in Kruger National Park, they went around and they measured the size of baobabs at some point. And then Rob Taylor, in his MSc, went back and found exactly the same baobabs. And he measured them. So he could start looking at, how fast do they grow. And now what was really interesting is that from this, he could see which baobabs, which size classes lived from the first survey to the next, which ones died. And what you really expect is that, mortality of baobabs is going to be highest for the juveniles because they get hammered by elephants. They get browsed on, You would expect that the smaller classes would be damaged the most, and the older classes not so much. But as it turns out, the older classes, well, they seem to be dying at a disproportionately high rate. So why are they dying? This is a baobab that's near the mouth, not the mouth, the confluence of the Olifants and the Letaba rivers. And you can see on the right-hand side a whole pile of rubble, and you can see that there was once a really big branch above that, which has fallen down and rotted away. And the rot is the cause. So this tree, I climbed up the edge of it, and you look inside, the inside of it is rotten. Going back to that outpost baobab, when we really were humiliated with the chainsaw, I saw that, hey, hang on, this tree, it's kind of like what are those chocolates which has got chocolate on the outside and marshmallow on the inside? It was, yeah, it's like a sweetie pie. It's got bark and everything on the outside, but on the inside it was completely soft and rotten. So with the team, you can see there, using a spade, we were able to cut through the rotten material, and actually I was able to find the very centermost part of the tree, which is, it's quite an interesting experience, because the piece of tree that I found was when this baobab was as thick as my finger, probably this tall. That's the piece of tree that I dated on this tree. But the point is that this tree was rotting, and it rotted from the inside. Sunland, yeah, this is not in the best state. So Sunland is the tree near Tsanin, which had the bar in it, this very famous tree. This is when it first started collapsing. Now both stems have collapsed, and it's a mess. And again, this tree was rotten on the inside. Pafuri, this is another baobab up in Pafuri that I sampled. This one was a small one. We never imagined that this would be rotten. But on the right, you can see that when we got to the center of it, it was rotten. This is a baobab that fell in up at near Mapungubwe, and I was not given permission to sample this tree, but we went back a while later, and the rot that caused the fall had now, you can see this is almost the same view, that tree is completely rotten away.
So do one at a time or not?
Ah.
Because you're now asking the middle of the three items, and how do they take turns on?
You're on to me. You're on to me. You know exactly where I'm going. Can I ask for you to be patient? I'm not going to answer it just yet. Okay, just some more examples. The Dorsland tree in Namibia collapsed. It's rotten. Holboom. Chaplin's used to be a very famous tourist attraction. The top left is what it used to look like. the bottom is what it looked like when I went to go and sample it, but it was rotten on the inside. Now, we felt that there was something going on. Why are these old, big baobabs dying at a disproportionate rate? And so we wrote an article which is that the demise of the largest and oldest African baobabs. And oh my goodness, I cannot tell you how much I despise the media since this. You know, people would interview us, and somehow they got the story that we said that the baobabs are going extinct. That's not what we said. But it just went completely viral. In fact, when you start looking at, you know, if you're involved in it, you get sort of angry about this. And then I started checking some of these references that were coming up in the international media, and you could see they hadn't even read the paper. They would cite what somebody else said, and the story just snowballed into these scientists saying that climate change is going to is driving baobabs to extinction. That is really not what we said. And so what I've done here is I've just put the abstract from that article, and you can see I've highlighted and underlined because we claimed not to know why they were dying. We just pointed out that they are dying. Well, that they're not going extinct is also, it also has to do with this. Where were we seeing these trees that were rotting and dying? And they're all down here in southern Africa at the southern limit of their distribution. That was part of why we thought it may be climate change. Now, we didn't want to say climate change, but the editors said you have to commit. And so we put in something speculative. It could be climate change. And the reason is this. If you have the distribution of a species, if you go to the line where the species exists to this side but doesn't exist to that side, what changes? Now, when you look at this distribution, it is the southernmost edge of the distribution of baobabs. And so whatever conditions existed to the south, maybe they've just shifted a little bit north. And as a result, those trees on the border are no longer adapted to the environment. Now, that's not the same as baobabs are going extinct because of climate change. But anyway, so I hope that you understand that, yeah, that this was a very weird experience for me. Now, one of the questions is whether there is actually a problem. We said yes, we think there is a problem, and I've explained why. But then Sarah Fenter came up with a counter argument that said, no, baobabs are absolutely resilient. And what was very interesting is she went back to exactly the same baobabs that we had looked at. She came up with exactly the same observations, which ones were dead and which ones had survived. But where we looked at the deaths, she looked at the survivors. And so her argument was, no, these things, it's not that bad. Well, this is science. And what I really appreciate is that Sarah and I are friends. So we can argue about these things, and we had some really good arguments. And where we've gone with this now is really, how can we reconcile these seemingly contradictory perspectives and those three things that I mentioned earlier? Why do they stop growing for 600 years? Why do they form ring structures? And what's the third one? Remember I said there's a test? Okay, yeah. So we've been working on trying to explain whether or not these baobab deaths are, like, what does it mean? Are we really facing something bad for baobabs, or what's going on? So we've started a program, and I'm going to explain the story to you sort of as it unfolds. And I'm going to start off with this baobab. This was quite a famous baobab, the Shumawini baobab near Shumawini Camp in Kruger National Park. I don't know if anybody has ever been there, but it used to be this tree that you would drive to, and you might find elephants. This is a very poor picture of what it looked like in its heyday. The elephants started to attack it. And so the sandparks put rocks around to try and protect it. Towards the end, it clearly, the elephants, you can put the rocks there, but there was something about this tree that the elephants wanted. And they really attacked it, and eventually it fell over. And so I got permission to go and sample the tree just to see how old it is. And there's me inside the bottom of the tree wielding a chainsaw, this time ego intact because the tree was mainly hollow. But you can see that this tree was also rotten in the center. And I almost think, this is speculation because I can't test it scientifically at this stage, but I almost think that it's the rotting core of the tree that it's quite pungent. It's also very warm. I must tell you, when these trees rot, they generate heat. I have a feeling that the elephants are attracted to that. The reason why they're attacking the tree is not for the bark or for fun. I think that there's something inside that they're after. That's speculation, so don't quote me on that. So this is the set of samples that I got from this tree. Let me just go back. What you're gonna see in these pictures is the series of samples that comes about from the little nick point in the ladder. Now, because the tree's fallen over, that's almost the bark lying on the ground. And then up to where I'm sampling is just about the center of the tree. So I'm going to show you a sequence of dates that I did through there. So down at the bottom, I got a date which is the equivalent of 1956, the year 1956, not years. And that kind of makes sense because we had lost some of the outer growth of the tree to the elephants. So 1956, we lost 50 years worth of growth. Then 28 centimeters in, the tree was nearly 500 years. Another 20 centimeters, it was 560. And you can see the progression up to the top where I've got 800 now, carrying on. Right to the center of the tree, I got a date of 1,000. And what I can do is plot the radius of the tree. So the radius 0 would be the center of the tree. And these are radiocarbon dates. Don't worry about the fact that there's little lines. That's another lecture. But on my x-axis is the calendar year. And from these dates, I can fit a model and say that when this tree started growing was round about 1,000 years ago. So another 1,000-year-old tree. And I don't know, it's to me, I used to go to this tree often as a tourist and just admire it. And then suddenly it falls over and you think that this tree has stood here for 1,000 years and suddenly it fell over, Okay, so now I'm going to try and reconcile the fact that we've got this rotting happening in the tree and how do we get the dates and how do we extrapolate the age of the trees. So, and this is the work that Sarah and I are working on at the moment. Now, the model starts out with a nice young baobab. Typically, it'll be a single stem tree like this one. It's got a ring structure inside. Everything grows concentrically and the tree just gets fatter and fatter just about equally in all directions. And then for some reason, the tree starts to buttress. Now, why this is happening, we don't know. We suspect, we've seen that where people have debarked baobabs, we start seeing that the tree starts to heal itself and it forms these buttresses where the bark was taken off. But it's also clearly linked to where roots are forming, and as the branches get heavier, and start leaning down more and more, the tree has to put more and more reaction wood underneath the branch, and maybe the buttressing is. It doesn't really matter. If you go and look around at baobabs, you will see once they get over a certain size, they all start to buttress. And so you can see quite clearly what the buttressing looks like. Now, the next thing that I think happens is this core rot. And the core rot, it starts at the roots. And part of, okay, let me try and explain what I think is happening here. When a baobab puts out its roots when it's a small tree, that's fine. Now it grows these big branches, and it actually needs to put out more roots, and it swamps the old roots. So the original roots from a tree when it was this big are now of no use to the tree when it's 2 meters across. And I think that those roots die, and that is a point of vulnerability, because the trees are protecting themselves with their bark. But now you've got these roots, the original roots from the tree, which have died. So as the tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it kind of, the old roots become non-structural, and they die. And I think that you have rot that starts to creep in from there. Look, this is again hypothetical, but we know for sure that it's spreading up from the center of the tree, because in even the smallest tree where we've got rot, it always starts at the center of the tree. I didn't mention this, but when I was showing you those trees that are rotting, we sampled trees in Madagascar. They're also rotting. So it's not unique to South Africa. Now, if that rot moves up the core of the tree, and then it starts spreading outwards, if that rot gets wide enough, then the tree becomes structurally unstable. So the structural ring is no longer enough, the tree will die. But, oh yes, and here I'm again speculating that I think that rotten material is actually what the elephants are after. Now, what happens if you've got a buttressed structure? You basically have these bark, you've got to see this from the inside of the baobab. You've got these bark tongues which are pointing in towards the center of the tree in between these buttresses. And now the rotting spreads outwards, but as soon as it reaches the point where the tree is buttressed, it will be open up to the air. That changes things a lot, because you go from an anaerobic to an aerobic environment, and that rotten material will waste out of the tree. And here's the thing. Because they are succulents, they heal themselves. So if the tree has got even if you look at elephant damage years later, if you go to where the damage has happened, where the bark has been taken off, and you rub it, all the dead and dry material will fall off, and you will come onto these little nodules, which if you scratch them are green. And the tree has produced new bark inside the wood to protect itself. So if you have a situation where the tree grew up, it buttressed, it rotted down the middle, and that rot spread, but now it ventilated and so the rot could get out, then the tree heals itself. And in doing that, it creates bark on the inside of the tree, where the center of the tree used to be. That picture, by the way, is the Labamba baobab. Remember I said you could get 15, maybe it was only 10 people you could get in it. But that's the hollow of the tree. But what you can see, on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see those little nodules. That's where the tree recently healed itself. But eventually it forms bark, and from the radiocarbon dates, we know that it carries on growing inwards. If you have rot that reaches those buttresses, now that's all gone. Each buttress heals itself and becomes a separate stem. And that's why we get these fused stems together. And also why we get these ring-shaped structures amongst the baobabs. Now, this is answering the question. If each buttress now becomes its own little stem, can't it start to rot down the center? And the answer is yes, it does. That's also the Labamba baobab. And if you look at the footprint, you can see obviously the cavity is where originally there was a stem that was lost. The ring of stems around it were probably buttresses, which then became independent but fused. But if you look at the top left of the footprint, that's the figure at bottom right, you can see these like two dents, and it's not round. It's not like a normal tree. And there's definitely an area where a stem was lost. If you look at the photograph above, that's looking down that kind of plane where I believe two stems are missing. You can see that there's quite a lot of superstructure to the left, but nothing to the right. I think that there used to be stems there that have died, and it would have been through the same rotting process. So basically, that rotting process will happen. Now, this is pretty much hot off the press. We haven't got all of the results, but we found a baobab, Sarah Venter and myself. We found a baobab up in Limpopo that really has like a false cavity, but then that sits within wood, which is inside another cavity. And how often does this happen? And we think that on that tree, we may be seeing at least 3 generations of the tree buttressing, rot, buttressing. Now, with every single tree that we've dated had that ring structure, and we could not date the oldest part of the tree. And if we've had maybe up to 3 cycles of the tree rotting and then surviving it, and through the buttressing mechanisms growing some more, and the bits that are left are 2,000 years old, how old was the tree originally? So I think that these trees are much older than we think. And I think that some of these really big ones, it would not surprise me if they were originally 5,000 years old. But you can't quote me on that because I don't have a 5,000 date yet. And so this is, where we're heading at the moment was, are the baobabs dying because of some tragedy, or is this part of a natural process? This is the Glencoe baobab, great tea room next to it if you don't want to go and visit this tree. And it collapsed, but actually, if you look at it during the growing season, this tree will survive. And that I think is, we're seeing this natural cycle where the rotting of the baobabs, I don't know if it's induced by old age. If it's rooting, then it's old age. I don't know if it's exacerbated by climate, but whatever it is, it's a cycle that the trees sometimes survive, and if they do, they become these monumental old trees. So I'm going to end now, but I just want to say that this is research which has been done by a large number of people. And I just want to acknowledge that it's not all my ideas. And then with that, I'll say thank you. That's Bain's baobabs. We managed to get there when there was water in the pan. Bain's baobabs. Yeah.
We went on a little motorboat.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to get to. But when the water's in, it's a lot longer to get there than when the water's out.
I've got several, but I'll ask one first. I just want to get clarity. So when you say you have these multiple stems in one tree, it's actually one tree that turned into several trees.
Yeah,
it's not several trees that combine together.
I'm pretty sure that it is clonal. It's one genetic tree, not multiple seeds that produced it.
I mean, old people die. So old trees die. So that's a natural thing. I will be more interested, where are all the young ones? And there are some areas where there are lots of young ones. Sarah Fenter's study showed that.
Yeah, so the Rob Taylor's study also looked at that, and one thing's for sure, they do better outside of the national park than in. Now, okay, this is maybe a little bit getting off the subject from my side, but when I look at these baobabs, you know, you get these big baobabs that will sort of fit into this room-ish, that size. And they always seem to come out between 900 and 1,400 years old in the Limpopo Valley. Now, between 900 and 1,400 years ago is when the Limpopo Valley got populated by first the Schroeder, then K2, and then Mapungubwe, these kingdoms, and they were trading ivory. So the reason why people could move there, and the baobab records show this, is because it rained more. And if it rained more, the people went there, and people in those days, they didn't like elephants. They hunted them to trade ivory on the Swahili coast. So I think that when conditions are really good, the people were keeping the elephants out and the baobabs were germinating. Then, if I went all the way back, the next period of good rains was around 500 years ago, and guess what? We see a whole cohort of new baobabs that are 500 years old. And again, I think it's people versus elephants. So where are the babies? I think that in the park, they're getting hammered by elephants. Outside of the park, we just need to wait for a good, wet couple of decades, and we will get them again.
And in cultivated fields, because that is what Sarah also showed. In the cultivated fields, you have a lot more younger baobabs, and the same with a student of mine that was doing a study in Namibia, Kamuela. I'm not sure if you met her, but she did a study of that, and some people remove the small ones, and some people keep them and nourish them to go bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Sarah's been doing remarkable work with communities actually cultivating them, the baobabs, and mostly they've been planting them around the houses, but certainly she's been encouraging that they don't be chopped out of the fields. I don't know if there's some element of competition in the bush relative to a field that may be driving that dynamic. I don't know.
Just the last thing on this. Have you been in Angola around Luanda?
I have.
Because there's a forest of baobabs. We traveled for 130 kilometers along the main road, all the way just baobabs. And it's like a dense stand of it.
Yeah.
Very interesting too.
But they also grow a different form there. They grow tall and thin compared to.
Yeah. Anyway, that's interesting.
Sorry, and I just want to follow up on that one because in Senegal, I don't know if you've seen, it's all digitata, it's all the same baobab, but they grow like mushrooms. They're fat stemmed like this, and then little branches at the top. But it's exactly genetically the same as ours.
Thanks for that, Professor. Just quickly, in terms of when you talk about the climate modeling and how it actually shows multiple rings in a year, right? Is there perhaps a lag effect in terms of when because it's a succulent, it accumulates water. So it wouldn't show immediately at the time, but it stores water, and then within a year, whenever conditions are favorable, it may utilize that as resources. I mean, in terms of the storage of these massive trees, where exactly is the water being stored? Because if you look at the root rot or the core rot scenario, well, first of all, it attracts elephants, the water, because we know also elephants can, especially the Kalahari, smell and take for water. But if it's I'm just wondering, is it root rot related, or is it perhaps because of the storage mechanisms within the tree itself that it actually is not utilizing the resources optimally anymore, and it starts rotting at a specific place? Because it's not, the center of the tree not supposed to be like hard dead wood.
In a normal tree.
Okay, so just want to clarify that. So in this case, it wouldn't be necessarily.
Sure. Okay, there's quite a lot there. This mechanism, I'm seeing that a lot of hardwood trees are also rotting from the center.
Okay.
And very often you'll find trees where they've ventilated at the bottom because the bark, and you look inside and they're hollow. Mice and snakes love it. So if you start looking around, you'll see that more and more often. And I think it's the same mechanism. But they don't have the ability to respond to it the way a succulent does. So that's where the succulent thing comes in. Now let me just talk a little bit about the water. If you go during the hottest part of the dry season, walking around looking at baobabs in the Limpopo Valley, carry water, wear a hat, and when you get to the side of a tree, you can put your hand into the ground where it has shrunk. And then the same tree, you can go there during the wet season and there's no gap. So certainly the trees are swelling, and we try to put dendrometers onto baobabs to see how much do they grow.
Yeah.
And it was useless, because on a normal tree they'll put on a growth ring which becomes inert, and the next year you could measure the growth relative to that. But with the baobabs, because the whole thing was swelling, the dendrometers didn't work. Now there has been a study that looked at that water storage, and it's not a strong buffer against drought. So it's not enough to, for example, to see them through a winter. And it really depends on how much rain do you get in an event, and is that enough to recharge the tree, or it'll take what it can. But then if whatever water is used up, that's it. Then it goes inert again. Last point around the question. If the elephants are attacking the trees for the water content, then they should randomly attack all the trees. They seem to just choose one and then hammer it, or choose a few. They're not randomly deep attacking all the trees.
But would it be specific to signals that's being sent out that the water content in the tree or whatever has given it, like you said, they don't store that much water, but all of a sudden, because the more rot, there's more moisture.
Okay, yeah, that could be.
But don't they sort of expand and shrink high rainfall times and low rainfall?
Okay, the answer is yes. And sorry, no. One of the things that, if you look at a baobab, I can't remember if I've got any pictures of it here, but when things are good, they're going to grow and they're going to put out leaves. And when it's not so good, I think growth is going to be a bit slow. Now the rings, if you take 2 baobab rings from a live tree, they have a slimy layer in between, and you can peel them apart like 2 pieces of paper. And what I think sometimes happens is that if you go from a dry period to a wet period, there's this massive investment in the branches, and then a baobab branch is big and heavy, and you get these structural failures on the underside of the branch. So if you look on the underside of the branch, it almost looks like creases where the wood has slumped. And I've actually sectioned that, and I've seen that the ring structures, because they're not bound into each other, they slip relative to each other. It's almost a little bit of tectonics, and that the branches pull down the outer structure of the tree.
Fascinating talk. I don't know if this is on. Just 2 questions. are those roots high enough in dew? I mean, how are they picking up dew? Is dew ever heavy enough? I mean, enough dew to actually reach the roots? Does dew play a role at all in the drier periods, or is there not much dew in those areas?
I don't know the answer to that, but the roots are at the surface.
So they could theoretically pick up dew.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other one was: has anyone sampled the microbial content of the dead part? Because I'm wondering, there's so many fungi and algae and sort of cyanobacteria have psychotropic effects. Are the elephants going after psychotropic function in these fungi? Because that would also, and also then looking at the ants, which are the ants and the beetles, which farm fungi, and are there certain fungi that they're more susceptible to, and that could be going through wind. I mean, that could also explain, why you got these series of deaths at one time.
No, great question. We did collect samples and we sent them to, I can't remember the name of the lady at Tucky's.
At ARC.
But I never heard anything. And I mean, when you collect them, you've got to make the samples, you've got to make sure that they were collected without you contaminating them.
But there are ways of doing it. I think
it
would be a fascinating assessment just to see, and which ones are dying, and in your living and dead ones to see which ones are, but which microbial populations there.
So I mean, that is something we considered, and we haven't got results.
Well, I'll
back
give you the
on
right people to do it if you want.
Just a suggestion, an idea. Fungi break down wood into sugars, and that's very bioavailable for anything, even earthworms. So maybe they can smell that and would go for that.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. I don't really know what's motivating the elephants, but certainly,
Is there any other plants similar, like the balsa wood, what is rotten in the same way as the baobabs? This was one question. The other question: did you ever check how deep does the rot go into the taproot?
Okay, I can't answer about balsa wood because I haven't worked on them. But the taproot, I've worked on, I don't know, maybe 8 baobabs that fell over. None of them had a taproot. There was a hollow in the ground, and you can look at the bottom of the tree. I can show you photographs of this. And there's a mangle of roots, which are mostly from the juvenile stage of the growth. But from the radius, from the outside, are these roots that go out for many tens of meters. So no taproot.
As a young tree, do they have taproot?
As a young tree, they do have a taproot.
So what age do they usually use?
Are you asking all the hard questions? I don't know, but
These are the kind of questions. No, surely there must be ways of, with the radiation, the way we can now look through soil, the miners can look through soil. There must be ways of actually looking underneath the ground.
yeah.
Speak into the speaking light.
Sorry. We have to repeat that. I'm just saying that it'd be very interesting to look at now with our modern, I don't know the terminology, where we've got the ability to be able to look into soil. The miners can see into soil. What this laser, how do they look into soil? But it might be a way, a non-invasive way of looking in and just correlating the size, because I don't think size correlates with age so much, but if you could do, correlation of size versus, the presence of a taproot, and when it loses its taproot towards, the
Look,
subterranean roots.
I'm just thinking out loud now, but maybe the point at which it starts buttressing is the point at which it shifts from taproot to lateral root dependence. Yeah.
And if you look at the fungus there, the microbial, and we could probably plot.
Yeah, look, the nitrogen dynamics also change between taproot and lateral, so we could look at nitrogen dynamics as well.
Which would then select for certain microbes.
Yeah.
So yes, okay.
I would like to know the observation that you made, that it's worse in the Kruger. And you also implied that when elephants were being shot for ivory, the baobabs had a better chance. Do I understand that correctly? We saw in Tanzania the elephants ravaging the baobab trees, all of them. So I don't know if they had rot root there already, but they just, that may be the only thing to eat there. There's nothing else in the winter. So that is what they then go for. Now I'm wondering whether if elephants are hanging around baobabs a lot, and we see this, is there not something in their dung or something in their teeth? Because we don't have a bacterial explanation. I think you should actually follow up on that to find out what if that person that you sent the samples to can't give you sort of an answer. So I'm thinking whether the elephants are not even adding to the rot business. That's just this is now you go with it.
So I like that idea because to test it. So first of all, the elephants are not using their teeth; they're using their tusks. And I really like the idea of going to Kruger and sampling elephants now. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm really pleased the way that the audience has picked up on that rot because I think that's the core of the problem. Sorry, that's the information.
I think as soon as the elephants get hold of the tree and they start stripping its bark, I think it just loses condition, like an old person. Just loses condition and it's more likely to rot when there are no elephants stripping. And the natural processes would be able to go on if the integrity of the wood is still intact.
So one of the points that I made, but I didn't mention it, so it was in one of my slides, is that once you've got a ring structure, the elephants can only attack the outside. And even between the stems, you actually find the original bark. So the communication between roots and superstructure is protected once you've got those ring structures. And it's part of the reason why we believe that they reach this monumental age, because they form these rings. If you won't get a 2,500-year-old single stem tree, it will have been destroyed. It couldn't protect itself. But a multi-stem structure can protect itself.
So once it opens and you've got the gap in, is it more prone to rot?
No, less.
So that's a survival strategy, or it's more prone?
It's good for it because when you have rot down the center of the tree, it's wet inside there and it's hot. Honestly, it's so rotten that you can just put your hand into it and you can barely not keep your hand there. It's so hot. But as soon as you have a hole, aerobic processes kick in and it will dry out.
Not just cooking itself, is that not the problem?
Could be, but
Well, I want to, on both the questions, one on the root system, one on the bark. And many places you see that people use a lot of bark off baobab. And baobab bark actually recovers very quickly. It's not you remove the bark and it's not rotting because of that, because it recovers so quick. The other thing about the root system, I think it has got two types of root. The tap root, and that I see also Mopani woodland in the same areas where you have baobabs. You have a tap root that goes down, and I don't know the baobab tap root. But their roots, there's some big ones, they spread a long distance around the tree. And with that, they would have feeder roots. So when you have litter fall, like during the deciduous part, you have a lot of leaves in the natural system. You have the feeder roots that take the nutrients from a decomposing leaf litter. And that's our problem. When you have some of these big trees and becomes a tourist attraction, people don't take care of, you have people driving with their cars right up to the tree. There should be a boundary for 20, or maybe 50 or more meters away from that tree, that nobody should go there. Because that feeder root system is a very important part for the vitality and health of the trees.
Can I?
The elephants would do the same thing. It's the rockies trample around the roots. The elephants do the same thing. So I've got this thing against elephants.
But there are places where there are baobabs and there are no elephants.
And they're also dying.
No, they look healthy. I don't know, they also die. Everything, all populations of people or animals, at some age, people start to die, animals start to die, trees start to die. That's a normal thing. The problem is, do we understand the causes of that death?
Can I just throw out an anecdotal story, because I worked on mapanis. Mapanis are the sneakiest trees in the bushveld. They've got a taproot and they've got shallow roots, and we put heat pulse sensors to see which direction the sap was flowing. And at the driest part of the year, the taproot was sucking water up.
Yeah.
The lateral roots was putting water out. And we could see that the plants around it were getting that water. And so why would they do that? Why, at the driest part of the year, give away water that you've worked so hard to get? And I think it's nitrogen. I think it's because you get the mycorrhizal association because of the water source, and in return, the mapani gets nitrogen. So, yeah. That's
We've dug out a lot of roots of mopani trees. It's like the baobabs. The central tree may die, but they have a whole ring of young trees, and they look like separate trees. But when we dug it out, it's all one root system.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everyone for listening and questions.